I came home on a Sunday afternoon expecting the same thing I had seen 1,000 times before, my old porch light glowing above the front steps of the house I had spent nearly 4 years restoring with my own hands. Instead, I pulled into the driveway and felt my stomach drop so fast it was almost physical. The light was gone. In its place sat a glossy black surveillance camera mounted exactly where my fixture used to be, staring straight down at my driveway and front yard like it owned the place. The strange part wasn't just that it was there. The strange part was that I knew I hadn't installed it. The worst part was the cable running from the camera across my siding and disappearing toward my neighbor's property. That's the moment I realized somebody hadn't just put a camera on my house. Somebody had decided they had the right to use my house. Looking back now, that's what this story is really about. It wasn't a camera. It wasn't even privacy. It was about a man who honestly believed he had authority over things that didn't belong to him, and how that belief eventually crashed headfirst into city code enforcement. My name is Ethan Mercer, and at the time I lived just outside Asheville, North Carolina, in a brick ranch house built in 1957. It sat on a little over half an acre surrounded by old oak trees and enough distance between neighbors that people generally minded their own business. That's exactly why I bought it. After 20 years working as a mechanical contractor, I wanted peace. Not luxury, not status, just peace. The house was rough when I bought it. The roof leaked. The plumbing was ancient. Half the electrical system looked like it had survived 3 different decades of bad decisions. But every room carried history, and I love that. I spent evenings after work replacing flooring, rewiring outlets, rebuilding cabinets, restoring things people told me were easier to throw away. The porch light was one of the first projects I finished. I found a fixture at an antique salvage shop 30 miles away. Heavy bronze, hand-detailed, built back when people expected things to last longer than a warranty period. Every night, when I pulled into the driveway, that light felt like proof that all the effort had been worth it. For 2 years, life was pretty quiet. Then my new neighbor arrived. His name was Gavin. If you've ever met somebody who introduces himself like he's already speaking on a podcast, you know exactly the type. He owned a private security consulting business. Every conversation somehow circled back to surveillance technology, risk management, smart systems, predictive monitoring, or whatever buzzwords were trending that month. The first time we met, he walked over while I was trimming hedges near the property line. He wore mirrored sunglasses despite the fact the sky was completely overcast. We talked for maybe 5 minutes before he pointed at my porch light. "You ever think about upgrading that thing?" he asked. I laughed and said, "It works, so no." He nodded like a professor listening to a student give the wrong answer. "Smart lighting systems are the future." "I'm fine with the past," I told him. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind that says you're being judged. People who resist technology usually regret it eventually. At the time, I thought he was just another guy who loved hearing himself talk. What I didn't know was that Gavin had already started turning half the neighborhood into his personal experiment. Over the next few months, cameras started appearing everywhere around his house. Driveway cameras, fence cameras, garage cameras, cameras mounted so high they could practically see the weather arriving. Every conversation became a lecture about security. He'd tell neighbors how vulnerable they were, how criminals targeted quiet communities, how everyone needed more monitoring. Some people bought into it. Others rolled their eyes and avoided him. I stayed neutral. As long as he stayed on his property, I didn't care what he installed. Then I left town for a weekend fishing trip with my brother. Just 2 days. That's all it took. When I came home and found that camera mounted on my house, something felt wrong in a way I still struggle to describe. It wasn't anger at first. It was disbelief. My brain kept trying to find a logical explanation because the obvious explanation was insane. I parked the truck, walked around the front yard, and followed the cable with my eyes all the way to his property. Then I marched next door and knocked on his door hard enough that I knew he heard it. A few seconds later, the door opened halfway. Gavin stood there looking completely relaxed. I pointed toward the camera. "What is that?" He barely glanced outside. "Oh, you noticed? You put a camera on my house." "Technically," he said, "it's part of a neighborhood security initiative." I remember staring at him because I genuinely thought he was joking. Take it down. He shrugged. It improves coverage for the entire street. It's on my house. You're benefiting from it too. That's when I saw it. The confidence. The certainty. He wasn't asking permission because somewhere along the line he convinced himself he didn't need it. And standing there on his porch, listening to him explain why I should be grateful for being monitored by equipment attached to my own property, I realized this situation was about to become much bigger than either of us expected. For a few seconds, I just stood there looking at him, trying to decide whether I was dealing with arrogance, stupidity, or some combination of both. Gavin leaned casually against the door frame, like we were discussing lawn fertilizer, instead of the fact that he had attached surveillance equipment to somebody else's home. "You're serious?" I asked. "Completely," he said. "People get emotional about cameras. Once they understand the benefits, they usually calm down." I laughed. And that surprised him. Not because anything was funny, but because the situation had crossed so far into absurd territory that my brain didn't know what else to do. "Take it down," I repeated. "Today." He shook his head. "I think you're overreacting." Then he delivered the sentence that would end up costing him thousands of dollars. "You can't fight progress, Ethan." I remember looking at him for a moment before saying, "Watch me." Then I turned around and walked away. Most people expect some dramatic shouting match at that point. There wasn't one. That's because I'd spent enough years dealing with contractors, inspectors, permits, and legal paperwork to know something important. The loudest person in a conflict is rarely the one who wins. The person with documentation usually does. The second I got back to my house, I started taking pictures. Not a few pictures. Hundreds. Every angle of the camera. Every mounting screw. Every section of cable. Every point where it crossed the property line. I photographed the junction box where my original light had been removed. I photographed the damage to the mounting plate. I photographed the serial number printed on the side of the camera housing. Then I recorded video while narrating everything I saw, including the date and time. Years working construction had taught me that memories become arguments, but documentation becomes evidence. The next morning, I called a licensed electrician I'd worked with before named Ron Delgado. Ron had been in the trade for almost 30 years and had the personality of a man who'd already seen every dumb thing people could possibly do with electricity. When he arrived and saw the camera, he stopped in the driveway and just stared at it. "Please tell me that's your camera," he said. "No." He looked at the cable running toward Gavin's property. "Please tell me he didn't wire that into your house." That's exactly what he did. Ron climbed the ladder and spent about 15 minutes inspecting everything. When he came back down, his expression had changed from confusion to concern. "This is bad." "How bad?" "Whoever installed this modified your electrical system without authorization. No permit. No inspection. And based on what I'm seeing, he used your existing junction box to power his equipment." Meaning he's literally using your house to run his surveillance system. I felt my jaw tighten. "Can you put that in writing?" Ron smiled. "Already started." That report became the first domino. The second domino came when I called the county code compliance office. To be honest, I wasn't expecting much. Most people imagine code enforcement as some sleepy department that takes weeks to respond to anything. Apparently, unauthorized electrical modifications tied to surveillance equipment get their attention pretty quickly. 2 days later, an inspector named Melissa Crane arrived. Melissa was probably in her 50s, sharp-eyed, calm, and carried herself like someone who had absolutely no patience for nonsense. She listened while I explained everything from the beginning. Then she walked around the house, silently examining the installation. She looked at the camera. She looked at the cable. She looked at the photographs I'd taken. Finally, she stopped where the cable crossed the property boundary and raised one eyebrow. "Interesting," she said. "That's one word for it." She asked if I had permission forms, contracts, agreements, anything showing I had authorized the installation. I laughed. "Absolutely not." She nodded slowly. "Good. Keep every piece of documentation you have." Then she lowered her voice slightly and said something that immediately got my attention. "Mr. Mercer, this may involve more than a code violation." That was the first time I realized Gavin's situation might be worse than he thought. Over the next week, the county started investigating. What they discovered was almost impressive in a terrible sort of way. The electrical modification wasn't permitted. The camera installation wasn't permitted. The property alteration wasn't authorized. The equipment placement crossed ownership boundaries. And because the camera was gathering and transmitting recorded footage from private property without consent, several additional concerns suddenly entered the conversation. Every time investigators looked deeper, they seemed to find another problem. Meanwhile, Gavin acted like none of it mattered. In fact, he seemed annoyed that anyone questioned him at all. A few neighbors later told me he spent those days complaining that people were hostile to innovation. According to one neighbor, he actually described himself as a victim of anti-technology attitudes. That became significantly harder to argue 3 days later when I found an envelope shoved under my front door. It was from an attorney representing Gavin. I sat at my kitchen table and read the entire thing twice because I genuinely couldn't believe what I was reading. The letter claimed the camera installation was a temporary pilot program designed to improve neighborhood safety. It argued that Gavin had acted in good faith. It suggested that any misunderstandings could be resolved cooperatively. Then came my favorite part. If I wished to have the camera professionally removed, Gavin was willing to discuss cost-sharing arrangements. I actually laughed out loud. Here was a man who removed my property, altered my electrical system, mounted his equipment on my house without permission, and now wanted me to pay half the bill to fix what he'd done. I made copies of the letter and forwarded them directly to the county investigator. 2 days later, Melissa called me. She sounded amused. Did you really receive a demand to share removal costs? I did. It was a brief pause. That was a bold strategy. How's it working out for him? Another pause. Not well. Then she informed me that the county had completed its preliminary findings. Gavin would be receiving formal notices covering multiple violations. He would be required to remove the camera. He would be required to restore the property. He would be responsible for all associated costs. And if he failed to comply, additional penalties could follow. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt myself relax. Not because I wanted revenge. Honestly, I didn't. I wanted my porch light back. That's all I'd wanted from the beginning. But there was something deeply satisfying about watching reality finally catch up to somebody who believed rules existed for other people. A week later, the official notice arrived at Gavin's house. I know because I happened to be outside watering plants when the county vehicle pulled up. The inspector spent several minutes speaking with him at the front door. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. Gavin's body language told the whole story. The confidence was gone. The casual smile was gone. The lecture-giving security expert, who always had an answer for everything, suddenly looked like a man discovering that government paperwork doesn't care how smart you think you are. After the inspector left, Gavin stood in his driveway staring at the documents for a long time. Then he noticed me across the yard. We locked eyes for a second. Neither of us said anything. There wasn't really anything left to say. The county had spoken, and unlike Gavin, the county actually had authority. 14 days. That was the deadline the county gave him. 14 days to remove the camera, restore my property, and bring everything back into compliance. I didn't spend those 2 weeks celebrating. Honestly, I mostly went back to normal life. I went to work, mowed the lawn, met my brother for barbecue one Friday night, and try not to think about the strange fact that one of the biggest neighborhood conflicts I'd ever experienced had started because a grown man couldn't understand the difference between his property and mine. The interesting thing was how quiet Gavin became. For months, he'd been the loudest voice on the street. Every conversation had somehow turned into a seminar about security, technology, or why everyone else was living in the past. Then suddenly he disappeared. No more speeches. No more unsolicited advice. No more walking around pointing at other people's homes like he was conducting inspections. A few neighbors later admitted they had started questioning some of the things he'd installed around the neighborhood after hearing what happened at my place. That's the funny thing about authority. Once people realize it's self-appointed, it tends to shrink pretty fast. On the morning of the compliance deadline, I woke up early and poured myself a cup of coffee. Around 8 o'clock, a licensed contractor's truck pulled into the driveway. A county vehicle arrived shortly afterward. Melissa stepped out carrying a clipboard and a camera. Everything about the scene felt strangely official for something that had started with a porch light. I stood on my front lawn while the contractor set up a ladder beneath the camera. Across the property line, Gavin stood in his driveway, watching silently. He looked exhausted. Not angry, just exhausted. Maybe reality had finally caught up with him. Maybe he'd spent the previous 2 weeks arguing with lawyers, insurance companies, and county officials. Maybe he was simply learning a lesson most people figure out much earlier in life. You don't get to improve somebody else's property without their permission. The contractor climbed the ladder and started removing the hardware. One screw, then another, then another. It took less than 20 minutes to undo what had caused months of conflict. Melissa documented everything. The wiring, the removal process, the restoration work. Every step was photographed and recorded. The camera came down first, then the unauthorized cable, then the altered components inside the junction box. Finally, from a padded container inside the contractor's truck, my original bronze porch fixture emerged. I hadn't seen it since the day it disappeared. Somehow seeing that old light again hit me harder than I expected. It sounds ridiculous, I know. It's just a light fixture. But when you've spent years building something with your own hands, small things stop being small. They become symbols, memories, pieces of your life. Watching that fixture get reinstalled felt like watching somebody put a missing piece back into a photograph. The contractor finished the work, tested the connection, and stepped off the ladder. A moment later, the light flickered on. Warm, steady, familiar. Exactly the way it had looked for years before somebody decided his opinion mattered more than my ownership. Melissa completed her inspection and signed the final paperwork. That's when the last memorable moment happened. Gavin finally spoke. Not to me, to her. "This isn't over," he muttered. "I may still pursue legal action." Melissa looked at him calmly, handed him a copy of the compliance report, and said something I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. "Mr. Pierce, you're fortunate the homeowner chose the route he did. I'd spend less time talking about lawsuits and more time appreciating that he didn't pursue additional options." The silence afterward was incredible. Gavin didn't have a response. For once, there was no speech, no lecture, no explanation about progress, just silence. That evening, I sat on the front porch with a glass of iced tea and watched the sun disappear behind the trees. As darkness settled over the yard, the bronze fixture switched on automatically, casting the same soft glow across the steps that had welcomed me home for years. It felt peaceful again, the way a home is supposed to feel. But here's the part people still argue about whenever I tell this story. Some folks say I should have sued him. Others think I should have called law enforcement immediately. A few even think I overreacted and should have worked things out privately. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're wrong. I honestly don't know. Why to know is this: the camera was never the real problem. The real problem was entitlement. The belief that intelligence, technology, expertise, or good intentions somehow give you authority over somebody else's property. They don't. Ownership still matters. Consent still matters. Boundaries still matter. And every once in a while, somebody learns that lesson the expensive way. As for Gavin, he still lives next door. We don't talk much. We wave occasionally. That's about it. The cameras around his own house remain. The cameras around everyone else's houses do not. And every night when my porch light comes on, I still smile a little. Not because I won, not because he lost, but because that small glow reminds me that some things are worth defending, even when they seem insignificant. Now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and found a neighbor had replaced part of your property with surveillance equipment without permission, would you have handled it the same way, or would you have taken things much further? Let me know in the comments, because I've heard strong arguments from both sides, and honestly, this is one of those stories where people rarely agree on where the line should be drawn.